I was tasked with yet again another going away piece. This time it was a little special though because the guy leaving really likes Star Wars. So what we did was we got a Stormtrooper toy, if you will, and I had to mount it to a piece of wood. And what I used for the wood was a used oak pallet that I scored for free. And I didn't know if it would clean up too well, but surprisingly enough, it cleaned up great. So stay tuned and you can see just what I did.
I started with two different pieces of lumber. They're both oak. The piece on the left is an already processed piece from an earlier project, and the piece on the right is a piece from an oak pallet. I ran both pieces through my planer to start out with. The first piece, the already processed lumber, I just wanted to make sure there were smooth surfaces. And then the piece of oak, I was a little hesitant at first because it was so sun damaged, but I think it ended up looking pretty dang good. As you can see here, even a sun damaged piece of wood can clean up pretty nice after running it through a planer. My next step before processing the wood any further is to take the Stormtrooper toy that you see here and measure the width of the base of its feet so I know exactly how large to make the wooden base. I didn't really get too exact, but I knew that the feet of the Stormtrooper were 6 inches wide, so I wanted to make sure that the wood that I had to work with in between these two nail holes was more than 6 inches, preferably 7 to 8 inches. So now that I knew that I had enough wood to work with, I made my first cuts, and all that I did was I cut in between all of the nail holes so that I got as much workable wood surface as I could get. If you notice, I'm actually cutting 3 pieces. I'm only going to use 2, but I cut 3 so that I could choose the 2 best looking ones. After I chose my 2 best looking pieces, I went to my crosscut sled and I made some more precise cuts. I first cut both pieces to 8 inches, and then I flipped them to the other side and I cut off another ½ inch so that I had 2 pieces that were both 7½ inches long. I sanded all edges down with 150 grain sandpaper, and then I set them up to glue and dry overnight. I just picked the 2 edges that melted together the best, and then I applied glue, spread it over, and clamped them down. And the next day I had this lovely block of wood, and I had to scrape all the glue off so I could run it through the planer. All I did on the planer was I ran it through until I had flat surfaces on both sides. Then I ran it through my joiner to square it up, and what I did was I ran it through on the end grains first, so that way if any of the edges chipped, the chips would go away once I ran it through on the other sides. And then I sanded the entire block down to 150 with my orbital sander. Then I cut my smaller oak piece to about 1/2 inch wider on all sides than the oak block, and then I sanded that down to 150 grit as well. But before sanding down any further, I put my edges on both my pieces of wood. You can see on the smaller piece I put a Romano G edge, and then on the block of oak I just put a round off edge. That's because they're going to get meshed together, and that shorter piece will be the bottom part of the base, and then the oak will be the top part. Sanding the thin piece was easy because all I had to do was sand it down to 400 grit and I was done. However, the oak block was a little more difficult because, as you know from earlier in the video, this was from a pallet, so it had a lot of blemishes and holes, so I had to fill all of them with epoxy first. And once that epoxy was dried, then I had to sand it with my orbital again because I wasn't going to hand sand all that epoxy away, and then it would be ready for hand sanding. After all that sanding, now I'm finally ready to join the 2 pieces together. So again, I find myself adding glue, spreading it around, clamping it together, and letting it sit overnight. Next, I chipped off any visible glue, sanded any razor blade marks away, and then prepped for staining. My stain of choice for this project was red mahogany. I applied a nice thick coat of the stain to all sides of the project and let it sit for a few hours. Using a clean cloth, I removed any excess stain and let it sit yet again so that there was no wet spots before I went to the next step. While the stain on the base was drying, it was then time to drill into the Stormtrooper, and I simply drilled holes into his feet that were large enough for my wooden dowel, and then I epoxied the wooden dowel into the feet. By then the stain was dry enough so I could mark where the dowels would be placed in the base, and then I drilled into the base so that I could place the Stormtrooper on top. Of course, before I ever mount the Stormtrooper, I need to protect the wood, so I apply a couple coats of wipe-on poly. And then I add felt pads on the bottom of the base so that it glides smoothly on any surface. And finally, I can add the glue for the dowels so that the Stormtrooper can be held in nice and snug in the base. As an added extra measure, I also added some epoxy to to go in between the feet and the base. And if you notice in this video, I'm adding clear. Later on I had to add a stronger epoxy. This clear epoxy wasn't strong enough, so I had to use the gray JB Weld type epoxy. And this was my end result. And I can tell you that the guy that received this was really pleased with it. Thanks for watching, and until next time, take it easy.